Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 16th of November. Today we're doing a frontline update. We're looking at the situation around Avdiivka, Horlivka, and Bakhmut. Let's begin by looking at Prvomaiske, where there are two changes to the front line that I'm gonna point out. The first one is a roughly 500-meter Russian advance in the area to the north of a local pond around Prvomaiske. So here you could see the extent of the Russian gains in red. You could see that they reached a local road that leads into the center of Prvomaiske and connects to the basically the main road that divides the village in half. And then if we go further south, we'll see that there is a geolocated video proving that the Ukrainians have forward positions that are located south of what was previously imagined to be the case. So I was able to, as a result, change the map to give the Ukrainians an additional, I believe, 1 kilometer advance. But it's not really an advance because the Ukrainians were always in these positions. It's more so just a mistake of my own. But nonetheless, it does show that the Ukrainians, despite very heavy Russian assaults that started about a month ago on October 10th around Prvomaiske, they have been able to hold onto their forward positions in most of these areas, especially within the village itself. On the flanks, you can see, as I showed before, that the Russians have been able to have some success. But in the actual residential areas and streets, they've been able to hold on to their positions, as proven by this video of the Russian FPV drone that strikes the Ukrainian trench. The Ukrainian trench itself is not that significant in size, and there's a pretty small garrison of Ukrainian soldiers defending it, but nonetheless, it is still enough to hold the current front line. And in this area, you do have very stiff resistance from the Ukrainian 59th Motorized Brigade. That's the unit defending this area. Moving on, we'll go to Avdiivka itself. And just to zoom out for a second and look at the different parts of Avdiivka that need to be understood before we do a deep dive into the situation around here. There are several different sections of Avdiivka that are of importance to both the Ukrainian and Russian side. You have the coke plant located over here, but the coke plant itself includes multiple facilities, not just the coke plant itself. There's also the rail line running through it and the facilities that are related to that. You also have the residential areas, including a lot of rural dachas that are located on the northern outskirts of Avdiivka. So for instance, around here, and then going into the center of Avdiivka, you also have a lot of these residential houses, one-story houses, not as many apartment buildings in this area, and going into the southern districts of Avdiivka as well. Then you have the Chimik district, which is located in the southwestern part of Avdiivka. I'll mark it in orange. You can see it over here. It's actually reminiscent of the Citadel in Bakhmut, if you remember that. The Citadel was this area with these large Soviet-style apartment buildings. So I believe this would be the equivalent of that within Avdiivka, because there are a lot of apartment buildings within this district that I have marked in orange. Although it is a rather small portion of the entire city, it is still a pretty good defensive position later on. Then if we go further south, you have the actual Promka industrial facility. And this place is very important because this, I believe, is the most fortified part of the entire Avdiivka sector. Other parts of the Avdiivka sector, of course, have been built up, but nowhere as much as this area specifically. In this area, you've had Ukrainian defenses built up since 2014, and there was especially a lot of an emphasis on it from 2016 to 2019. So you could see this is the Promka Industrial District, generally this area located over here. And on Google Maps, if you were to zoom in, you'd see a lot of those trenches for yourself. So this area, you've not seen really much of any movement by either side since 2014. The demarcation line is still the front line at the moment, besides a couple of minor changes, and it just shows you how difficult it is to make any sort of advances for either side. So as a result, you do have a component of the Russian and DPR forces that are fighting on the Avdiivka front that have been basically designated with trying to reduce the effectiveness of Ukrainian defenses in this area, trying to target their defenses. So for instance, you have a lot of artillery, FPV strikes on the Ukrainian trenches and dugouts in this area. You also had similar incidents of these Russian sappers that dug tunnels under the Ukrainian trenches, rigged them with explosives, and then blew them up in order to try to destroy the Ukrainian fortifications. So there's a lot of different ways that the Russians are trying to chip away at Ukraine's very strong fortress in this area. But for now, the Ukrainians, for the most part, have now withdrawn. What you'll see in this video that I've linked over here, you can see it on my map, is that the Ukrainian 110th Brigade their FPV hit a Russian tank that was able to enter into the Promka industrial facility. In the video, you could see the tank is nearby to a lot of the fortifications that were built by the Ukrainians. In the video, you'll also see that the different industrial facilities in this area, a lot of the structures have been significantly damaged, which does decrease the effectiveness of using them as a defensive position. But either way, what this does prove to us is that this area is not as solidly under Ukrainian control as was previously thought to be the case. A lot of the eastern part of the Promka industrial facility may actually be a gray zone at this point, but nonetheless, the Ukrainians do still hold onto very powerful defensive fortifications in the westernmost parts of this industrial facility. And it would not be fair to say that the Russians captured any part of the structures or any part of the trenches within Promka, because I have not seen any sort of footage of them actually having a permanent control in this area. This is the only footage we saw of a tank entering through this road that I'm going to mark in red over here before being spotted and hit directly by a Ukrainian FPV drone. And that was really the end of that specific incident, but it's more so about the general theme of Russia being able to try to infiltrate into these areas that were previously really difficult to enter, because this area has been under solid Ukrainian control since 2014. Now, looking at Avdiivka's northern flank, there are few reported advances. You have an advance to the south of the Terrakhon slag heap. Not that significant in terms of the advance, but it's about 800 meters. But the Russians were able to capture the wastewater treatment plant. You could see this is the facility over here. And then a bit to the east, the Russians were able to advance through open fields and nearly advance a kilometer in this direction. And this is generally being done as a two-pronged attack to reach the rural dachas, the northern outskirts of Avdiivka, where you do have very fierce Ukrainian resistance, where they've been able to hold back any sort of Russian assaults that are trying to gain a foothold into the city itself. But now you have this Russian pressure that is mounting from two different directions. You have the direction over here and the direction over here, most likely in an effort to squeeze out the Ukrainian defenders that are located in this this forwardmost position for the Ukrainian side in the rural dachas. Now, on the 15th of November, it was reported by various Ukrainian and Russian sources and maps alike that Russian forces were able to advance along the rail line in the north and the northwestern directions. So just to show the arrows to clearly indicate what that means, this would be the northern direction and this would be the northwestern direction along the rail line. So in essence, what happened was the Russians, they took advantage of their positions that were taken over in the past month during the offensive on the northern flank, which includes positions within the rail line itself. So for instance, over here, and also the open fields are to the west of Horlivka. So over here, where you do have some of those trenches that were set up by the Ukrainians in response to the initial Russian assaults. So the Russians used those captured positions as a springboard to advance further north and northwest. And you could see that as a result, they were able to advance in certain instances up to 1.5 kilometers at most, 1.7 kilometers, around that ballpark. And then a bit further north, they were also able to expand control of their basically bridgehead past the rail line. This rail line is the one I'm referring to. I'm going to mark it in red because around Avdiivka, there are two rail lines that I'm going to show in a second. This is one of them, and you can see that the Russians were able to overrun Ukrainian defenses in this area. They did that a couple of weeks ago, and now they've been able to expand their positions in tree lines and fields to the north of the rail line and get control of this specific area. Now let's look at the elevation map to analyze these Russian advances. So as you can see, the Russian advances are located within the red and yellow lines. So for like over here, for instance, this is where the Russians advance in the northern and northwestern directions. And then here's the Russian advances north of that rail line that we're talking about. So just to explain the significance of these advances, you can see that the Russians are choosing to specifically advance in an area that's located on higher elevation. They're advancing in an area that's smack in between two rail lines. You can see the two rail lines marked with the the white lines. There's two of them that are branching out, because basically what happens is you have a rail station at Ocheretini, which is located over here, and then from there two rail lines branch out. Both rail lines are located on higher elevation compared to the surrounding areas. And then you have the most prevailing height in the entire area that dominates the valley that goes into Avdiivka and the valleys to the north of Avdiivka that you could see on the map with the green and yellow color. So that prevailing height is located on the rail station itself in Ocheretine, which Ukraine still controls. But nonetheless, there are still the high ground that is closer to the front line, that is within or just on the rail line itself, which the Russians are advancing towards, and they were able to get control of some fields located on higher elevation, and they were able to get control of heights that are overlooking Ukrainian positions in Berdichi, for instance, overlooking potential Ukrainian positions around Stepove, looking past or looking over Ukrainian positions in the various supply lines that are leading into Avdiivka, and you could see a lot of those supply lines on the elevation map. I'll mark the supply lines like over here. You could see within this blue rectangle, you have a lot of the different villages that are feeding points for the resupply and for the reinforcements. So you have Simonivka, you have Horlivka over here, Berdichi, as I said before, and all of them are located on the valley before they reach the relatively high elevation areas of Avdiivka itself. And by getting control of this area, the Russians do have forward firing positions to, first of all, attack those supply lines, but also to flank the Ukrainian positions that are located in Berdichi specifically. And that is the significance of the advances over here. And then to look at the significance of the advances to the north of the rail line located over here. It's important because the Russians are now taking up positions on higher elevation on the northern rail line in the direction of Novokalinove. Novokalinove is this village located over here that I'm going over with the blue line. And what you'll see is that the Ukrainians are using Novokalinove as a forward defensive node, and sometimes actually using it to try to conduct their own counterattacks, to try to attack the Russian resupply, the Russian forces, the Russian columns that are organizing in Krasnohorivka to try to conduct further attacks for their own offensive. And that's why the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to Novokalinove, but this is going to be pretty difficult to do given the fact that the Russians are trying to take over the heights to the south of Novokalinove, as Novokalinove is a valley that is surrounded by heights on 3 different directions, and one of those directions is the southern direction. The southern direction is where you have the rail line running through in this area over here in this red rectangle where the Russians are currently advancing. Now, moving on to the specific situation around Stepove, the Russian infantry, they were able to operate in the outskirts or in some instances within the village of Stepove around November 10th, or perhaps even earlier than that, although there is not enough documentation of that. Footage from the 10th of November shows that the 47th Mechanized Brigade, utilizing their M2 Bradleys, fired onto Russian positions in the eastern houses within Stepove. So the video is located over here, and you can click on it on my map. And what you'll see in the video is that you have the fire onto the Russian houses, and then you have an FPV hitting Russian forces that are hiding within a cellar. So there are some basements in this area that are being used as hiding spots, and there were some clashes that were going on over the past week in this area. On November 14th, another video came out showing an M2 Bradley firing onto similar houses within Stepove. And then as it was leaving Stepove and going along this road over here that I'm marking blue in the direction of Berdichi, which is located over here, it was hit directly by a Russian FPV drone. And I believe this video is also from the 10th of November, so it might be from the same exact incident. But either way, it shows that over the past week, there has been some back and forth in this area with Russian forces utilizing their positions around the rail line to use it as a springboard to basically cross past it with their infantry and try to set up positions within the eastern houses itself. And then you have these Ukrainian attempted counterattacks to push back the Russian forces. And this has been going on for really the course of a week now. And a lot of the footage that's coming out is actually older. So for instance, in the video that I was talking about of the FPV, the Russian FPV hitting the Ukrainian Bradley at this location over here, there was a drone view which showed several other pieces of destroyed Ukrainian equipment. A lot of that Ukrainian equipment was most likely destroyed from the late October to early November days, because during that time period, like October 30th to like November 2nd, 3rd, there was a lot of these Ukrainian attempted counterattacks to try to push the Russians back from their forward positions around the rail line. And this is understandable, as the rail line is now being used as a forward position to begin attacks onto Stepove and also across Stepove just to the north, trying to flank Stepove and Berdichi. But in terms of making a definitive statement about who controls the village of Stepove, it is very difficult to tell that. And the reason why is because the village itself is really devastated by the war. There's not many good positions to set up a permanent presence in. It could happen where during the day you have fighting and clashes within the village, but in terms of staying there overnight or staying there for extended periods of time, at this moment, there's not enough evidence that either side does have permanent positions. In all likelihood, the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade has regrouped around Berdichi, and they are still sending Bradleys and other infantry fighting vehicles and perhaps tanks to engage with the Russian positions around the rail line. But in terms of their permanent positions, those are in Berdichi. And in terms of the Russian permanent positions, those are either at the rail line or behind it. So for now, Stepove should be considered a gray zone unless there's some sort of information that comes out following the recording of this video. And finally, looking at the coke plants, what you'll see in this area is that the Ukrainians do still have full control over the industrial facility. The Russians, they were able to slightly advance in this area. There's a geolocated marker which shows that there were 3 Russian infantrymen that were hiding in a mound that is about 250 meters from the coke plant. You can measure the distance yourself. But the thing is, once they were spotted by the Ukrainians, they sent an FPV drone to target those Russian forces. And so even that specific attack, which included just 3 Russian infantrymen, so most likely it was some sort of reconnaissance operation to try to get more on the ground information about the extent of the Ukrainian defenses over there, including the extent of their infantry positions around there. But nonetheless, even this expedition by the 3 Russian infantrymen was really repulsed by that FPV strike. And so nonetheless, the situation has not really changed around here. The Russians have not been able to enter the coke plant. The Ukrainians have not withdrawn from the coke plant. So it is the status quo. Now moving on from the Avdiivka area and focusing on the area around Horlivka, just to the northwest of it, what you'll see is that there was a geolocated video. And this area, we've not seen many videos from here, and so my map is actually off. I'm going to take some time to adjust it, but nonetheless, here is the footage itself. What you'll see in this video is that you have Russians shelling the Ukrainian forces at the really 2014 demarcation line. The Ukrainians were able to cross the DPR defenses in this area that were built up at the time, and this is the first time they did this in a specific area. In that entire period of time, 9 years, they were able to enter the trench at the Chorna Kurhanka quarry. And upon doing that, then I believe this was a small Ukrainian force, as was shown in the video. Although the video itself, it is a bit grainy, it's hard to tell what's going on over there. They were generally located within this position over here on this hill. They were spotted by the Russian artillery, and eventually, following an artillery bombardment, the Ukrainian infantry did withdraw. So for now, it does appear that this area is a gray zone, but either way, it is significant. Just like the Russians crossing over into the Promka industrial facility was significant in the sense that they crossed over the demarcation line in the same area, the Ukrainians did the same thing. But either way, there is not really any hope for further development of an attack deeper into Horlivka, given how fortified it is and given the commitments on other parts of the front line. So it is interesting that the Ukrainians would choose to attack in this area. Perhaps it does have to do with trying to divert Russian attention away from what's going on around Avdiivka to focus on other parts of the Donetsk city front. Now moving on to the Bakhmut front, in the last video we discussed a minor Russian advance that occurred to the north and to the east of Klishivka. So let's mark where that occurred. It occurred in the areas over here, where the Russians were able to reestablish positions within the rail line where they were previously pushed out by the Ukrainians. And since then, I've seen additional reports of the Russians being able to expand their control around the rail line. For instance, I saw reports of the Russians being able to get control of the areas just to the east of Avdiivka, located within this blue rectangle that includes positions like windbreaks and the rail line itself. I haven't seen any confirmation of this yet, so I am waiting before making a definitive statement. But either way, we have seen an increase in Russian assaults generally on Klishivka from the north and from the east, as I discussed before. This is also confirmed by Ukrainians shelling Russian positions closer to the Ukrainian positions in Klishivka than it was previously imagined. But either way, in this video over here, what you'll see is that there was the Ukrainian 93rd Brigade. Their artillery was able to repel a nighttime attack by the Russians. In that attack, most likely they were trying to reach their positions in the forested areas right next to the rail line, and then perhaps from there trying to cross it. But before they were able to make it, about, a couple hundred meters away, about a kilometer away, they were spotted by the Ukrainians, and the artillery really dispersed their entire squad that was trying to reach their destination. And you also had a couple of instances throughout the past couple of days, around November 14th, 15th, that entire area, where you had Ukrainian ATGM crews that were basically waiting for Russian BMPs and for Russian vehicles that were trying to make their way to the front line around Klishivka and trying to fire onto them, trying to prevent the movement of infantry closer to the front line to help support the Russian assaults in this area. So in terms of territorial changes, I can't really confirm any of them around Klishivka. Going further north, there are some pretty interesting claims that have been made, and specifically, the claim that was made that I saw circulating is that the Russians were able to advance, I believe, around 2 kilometers in the southwestern direction, in the direction of Kromove. So this would be about 2 kilometers. Basically, the claim that I've seen circulated online a lot is that the Russians were able to reach an area that's pretty close to the T0506 highway. The T0506 highway is located over here. You could see it on the map, and it leads into Bakhmut, and it runs through Kromove. Kromove is very important for Ukrainian defensive hub. It's an area that the Ukrainians are using as a staging point to continue putting pressure onto the Russian positions within Bakhmut, and it is heavily fortified from the north. From the north, you could see that there are all these different black lines that I set up on the map. These are indicative of fortifications. And so this would be a significant advance in the direction of those fortifications and in the direction of the highway if it were to be true. But so far, I've not been able to find any sort of evidence of it. But what I did find evidence of is 2 videos which do indicate that there were some minor Russian advances, generally to the west of Bakhmut. So here's one of those videos. It's a video which shows the Ukrainians, they drop a munition from a drone onto Russian soldiers that were running to the southwest of Berkivka. Previously, the front line looked like this, meaning that the windbreak that runs through the rail line over here was contested. But based off of this geolocation, it can be confirmed that the Russians do have full control over the 2 parallel windbreaks that run along the rail line. And this would indicate that there was at least a certain amount of Russian movement in the area to the southwest of Berkivka. Now, looking at the area to the south of Orikovo-Vasilivka, we have a video over here from the 56th Brigade of their shelling of Russian positions and of their drones dropping munitions onto Russian infantry in forests and trenches that were built by the Ukrainians south of Orikovo-Vasilivka. So based on this, the new line around Orikovo-Vasilivka, or just to the south of it, is located around here, which would indicate an advance that amounts to about 1 kilometer in its totality. And so, yeah, that's all I have in terms of the information for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.